Due Process, winner of 19 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights and the 2011 Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Outstanding Discussion Series. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
It felt like a dream, like it didn't really happen, like I misheard it. It's a sinking feeling, a real sinking feeling, and like my heart got ripped out.
And it was all too real for more than 4 years of hard time, until two women, a mother and daughter, were able to prove that Kevin Rojas had himself been a victim. They did it without the help of DNA. Their story, a resulting new kind of innocence program, and the guru of DNA exoneration, all up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.
Hello and welcome to a new season of Due Process. A new look, a new set, a new studio, the Rutgers ITV, a new home at Rutgers Law School and the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. But still, the place to come for serious exploration and discussion of the critical issues of law and justice.
So for our first 3 shows of the new Due Process, the tragedy of wrongful conviction, the odds against exoneration, and the strategies employed by a growing number of lawyers, law students, and non-lawyers too, all determined to beat those odds case by case. I'm Sandra King.
And I'm Raymond Brown. And we begin with the basic question. What happens when a man or woman is arrested, tried, convicted, and innocent? How likely is it that the wrong will be made right? That may depend on 3 letters, DNA. It's made all the difference for hundreds of wrongfully imprisoned inmates. But what happens when there is no DNA evidence? We'll put that question to 3 experts, including Barry Scheck, the country's most famous figure in DNA exoneration. But his isn't the only way, which is where Sandy picks up the story of bucking the odds and sometimes even winning.
Raymond, it is the unlikely story of 2 women outraged by something they read in the paper, a mother and daughter with the gall to think they could do the nearly impossible, get justice for a high school kid with incredibly bad luck. An innocent kid who, because of the accident of the color of his jacket, heard himself pronounced guilty and sentenced to 30 years.
I kind of expected them to realize it, say, hey, we made a mistake, it's not you.
Because the system works.
Because I believe it works, and they'll realize at some point, hopefully sooner than later, that they made a mistake, and they'll let me go.
It's what any decent kid might think until the shock, the awakening of arrest, conviction, hard time, all for a crime he had nothing to do with.
I got charged with a murder charge. That's when I said, well, maybe the system doesn't work the way I think it does.
It had started for a Union City High School senior as a night in the big city. A quick trip across the Hudson for a walk around the village, a stop for some barbecue, then back on a PATH train for the short ride home. But before the train could leave this station, the nightmare was on full speed.
He had been mistakenly identified because of the color of his jacket. And
the orange jacket.
The orange jacket. And to my dismay, as I continued following the newspaper accounts, he was convicted in December 1991.
Convicted and sentenced to 15 years to life.
It felt like a dream, Like it didn't really happen. Like I misheard it. Like my heart got ripped out.
For a crime, a late-night shooting and murder on this downtown street that left one man wounded, another man dead, all based on the fact that Kevin Rojas, like the shooter, had worn an orange jacket, and on the identification of Kevin by the victim's friends, all of them proof of how unreliable eyewitnesses can be.
These witnesses were honest witnesses, but they were mistaken. Someone who was completely traumatized by having seen his friends shot, and this is the type of eyewitness that a jury is most likely to believe.
So the jury doesn't get the opportunity to look at this case in a way that would lead them to say, well, this kid just doesn't fit with this crime.
Absolutely
it's an orange
not.
jacket.
Absolutely not. The jury had no sense of that whatsoever.
He doesn't testify.
No. His lawyer advised him not to.
There were other issues, too, of shoddy police work, ineffective counsel, and overzealous prosecution, none of which would have worked to clear Rojas without a mother-daughter team with no experience in criminal defense, but a sharply honed passion for justice and fair play, and a penchant for reading the papers. But you and your mother, you didn't just notice this in the paper and say, oh, this is a miscarriage of justice. You really looked at it.
Well, it was as if you had seen a child fall down a well. My mother and I were bestirred to try to help him in some way, at first simply by making sure that an excellent attorney was retained for his appeal.
So before they'd ever seen him, before they'd even spoken to him, Priscilla Chenoweth, a lawyer with no courtroom experience, and her daughter Lesley, not yet a lawyer, went to work to save the teenage Kevin Rojas.
And I said, these two ladies are willing to help me, and they don't even know me. I said, there's a chance I can see the outside again.
As you looked at the case, you saw that there was much evidence that had never been investigated or presented to the judge or the jury.
He didn't have much of a defense.
No, there was hardly any defense.
And then there was a teacher who knew Rojas well and insisted it was impossible that his student had committed a senseless crime of violence.
It just boggled my mind. And everybody could reported that he was polite and nice. And it just was impossible for someone to think that he would be involved in a random shooting and murder.
So Lenny Farinola joined the new makeshift defense team on what's usually an impossible task: to exonerate an innocent inmate in a case that can't turn on DNA.
The investigation starts with the paper. You do it at your table, your desk. It's the witness statements. It's the police statements, police reports, the trial transcripts, the grand jury,
This is
the
not
pre-hearing.
sexy stuff. This is real tough work.
It's just grinding through the details.
The kind of details that now attorney Lesley Reisinger and her law professor husband Michael are grinding through still.
He's 43 now, and he was 24, so he's been in 19 years.
On other innocence cases without DNA at their newly launched Seton Hall clinic, appropriately called Last Resort.
We have all these innocent people in New Jersey. We know it.
Among those there for the send-off, Innocence Project founder Barry Scheck.
Only 5% of criminal cases at best have any biological evidence, where if you do a test, you can determine the identity of the perpetrator. So what about the other 95% of the cases?
Our own Raymond Brown.
To Mr. Brown and Mr. Scheck, I'd like to say that this is partly a celebration of the great work done by them and by hundreds of lawyers, journalists, and investigators around the country.
Exonerated inmates they'd help free.
Thank you.
And of course, Kevin Rojas, the man who actually started it all.
Thanks to the Lord and Priscilla Chenoweth and Lesley Reisinger and a team of other lawyers, I've got my life back.
After 4.5 years in maximum security,
Kevin was in there as a murderer. And he's sitting with murderers.
the reversal of his conviction and acquittal at a new trial, he's been able to make a new life on the outside.
My case wasn't a DNA case, and they did everything possible to find evidence that could get me off of this, get me back into freedom.
And with us here at Rutgers now, Lesley Reisinger, who helped win Kevin's freedom and now leads Last Resort Exoneration at Seton Hall Law, and Barry Scheck, co-founder with Peter Neufeld of the Innocence Project at Cardozo School of Law, and from another location here at Rutgers, New Jersey's Innocence pioneer, Jim McCloskey, founder and director of the Princeton-based Centurion Ministries. Welcome to all of you.
Lesley, the question that begs to be asked yet again, what possessed you, a non-lawyer, your mother, not a criminal lawyer, to think that you could possibly bring this sort of effort in a successful way? What made you think you could pull this off?
It comes out of necessity, I think. When you really have to do something, then you can do it.
If you had thought about what the odds were, would you have started it? Or were you lucky that you were a little bit ignorant?
We were lucky that we were ignorant. I think we learned a lot in the process about the prosecutorial resistance to examining cases for new evidence and the procedural difficulties that can be presented. So I think we were very lucky we were ignorant.
Barry, taking Lesley's work and your work and looking at it from a broader perspective, there's an argument that society says we'll live with a certain number of innocent people in prison. It's the price of doing business. It's the price of having a system. What do you say to the challenge that says there are no government resources devoted to this, at least not significantly, and it all has to be the work of individuals who fight the odds? Why don't we just say that society chooses to accept this high price?
Well, no system is perfect, so you're always going to have wrongful convictions. But we have really, in this post-conviction DNA era, begun to put more resources towards it. Yes, it's an international human rights movement. We now have 55 projects in the United States in our Innocence network. We have 7 abroad, including China, the United Kingdom, Australia. There is some government commitment to these programs, particularly in the United Kingdom. They have a whole institution that presumably is devoted to it, the Criminal Case Review Commission. And there's some government funding that's helped the Innocence projects, and they're based in law schools for the most part, and some public defender offices. But it is always going to be a ground-up movement. It's got to be people like Lesley who just get that passion behind it, because that's really what you need to win these cases.
And Barry, long before those kinds of reforms that have begun, Jim McCloskey was the pioneer here in New Jersey. Jim, the estimates of people who are wrongly convicted, imprisoned, rotting in prison, range from 1% to 10%. Where do you come down?
Well, first of all, nobody really knows or really has any idea what percent of the incarcerated are completely innocent of crimes for which they're imprisoned. But I think I can safely say that in America, there are thousands and thousands of innocent people in prison for very serious crimes, and perhaps a lot for nonviolent crimes. So they're buried in prison. Very few people believe they're innocent when you say you're innocent. And it's a tough job convincing anybody on the outside that you did not do what you're in prison for.
And you've done how many successful cases?
Well, we've been able to free in the last 31 years 44 people, all of whom were serving life or death for very serious violent crimes that they had no part in.
Now, Lesley, we can look at a lot of criteria by which you select cases, but since you're now starting out to pick on some of those thousands of cases, we're curious as to how you select them. And in particular question would be the Rojas case revolved to some extent around the issue of a tainted false identification, eyewitness identification. Recently, the New Jersey Supreme Court has ruled in a landmark case involving the Innocence Projects and the Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and others about changing how we think about eyewitness identification, and the United States Supreme Court is now going to hear a case on that subject. All of those things, do they suggest that you will be looking initially to maybe find cases that raise this eyewitness identification issue, or is your mind a complete open book as to what cases will be your first couple of cases?
Well, when you're dealing with a project like this, we're going to be trying to find, just as Centurion Ministries does, people who are serving long-term, so this is murders and rapes. And so eyewitness identification will be one of the biggest issues that you come across, and it is. And we're very grateful to the Supreme Court for having shown a beacon light, not only to our state, but to the whole country and to all the people who are involved in that case, as to all the dangers presented by non-blind identification procedures and all the other suggestive practices that have been engaged in that have led to many innocent people being identified and wrongly convicted. So in the cases that we look at, we are definitely looking for wrongful identification, but also perjurious witnesses, witnesses who are not really making a mistake, but they have been led into making statements that are clearly on an objective factual analysis underneath the
Which in some ways is the opposite of eyewitness identification, which can involve genuine mistake as opposed to...
It usually does, but sometimes it doesn't.
I'd like to, can I step in here for 1 second?
Sure, Jim.
Speaking of perjury, of the 44 people we have freed over the years, 11 have been convicted based on lying eyewitnesses. Not unreliable, not well-intentioned but mistaken, but eyewitnesses who have knowingly falsely identified the defendant as the perpetrator.
And Jim, you've done DNA cases and non-DNA cases.
We do mostly non-DNA cases. Of the 44 we freed, 8 have been freed based on DNA over the years.
So, Barry, let me ask you, Jim's cases are national. You take cases from all over the United States. Lesley's going to be looking just at New Jersey. Is it fair to say that New Jersey's been a little bit ahead of the curve, particularly on eyewitness identification? Our friend John Farmer actually started to make these changes a long time ago. Not to say that innocent people still aren't convicted here.
No, New Jersey has been a leader in this area. John Farmer was a Republican Attorney General in the Whitman administration. People don't understand that the New Jersey Attorney General has like plenipotentiary powers and can tell every prosecutor and law enforcement officer this is the way it should be done. And he did exactly that, implementing the best practices for eyewitness procedures based on sound science. And they were in place for 10 years when we went to the New Jersey Supreme Court and said, look, you have to change the basic legal architecture that governs the assessment and admission of eyewitness evidence in light of this science. And the Henderson case, the landmark case that they decided, really involved a failure to do double-blind administration of lineup procedures, which is one of the probably the most important best practice that can be adopted across the country. And the court did something very interesting, because the Innocence Project filed this humongous brief. We argued it the day that Obama was inaugurated. I'll never forget that, because we all ran off and watched the inaugural address. And they said, look, we don't have a record yet. We are going to remand this to a special master, Judge Jeffrey Galkin, for a hearing on the science. And the simple question is the Manson-Madison test, the standard for admission of eyewitness evidence, is it still appropriate in light of the science? And we conducted a hearing over a year in front of Judge Galkin, built a record that is the envy of the nation, and then the Supreme Court issued this landmark decision that I tell you is going to affect every state and federal court in the United States.
And your local counsel here?
Oh, well, it was a very unusual situation. We were amicus, right? But we filed the brief that basically proposed the legal architecture. And then it's very unusual because they said, we assign you to do the hearing. So, you know, I don't know. Maybe they knew that we somehow would be funded to do it. But it was great. And it was a terrific opinion. And all a unanimous court, and great thanks to the Chief Judge and his court.
We're going to explore eyewitness identification more depth with you next week, Barry. So let me come back to Lesley on an issue, again, of choosing. One of the other issues in the Rojas case was ineffective assistance of counsel. I think of this sometimes as one of the deep, dark secrets of the criminal justice system, along with prosecutorial misconduct, that we don't want to look at it because it's the working people who run the system. But you had a lawyer in a case as remarkable as is shown in the story that Sandy brought us, where his lawyer called called 3 character witnesses and did virtually no investigation.
Tells him he can't testify.
But our courts tend to defer to counsel, saying if you made a strategic judgment, we'll live with it. Do you think that you're going to have much success in looking at the prospect of looking at ineffective assistance cases, especially since your mother, who was 80-something at the time, basically got this ball rolling? I understand now in her
60-something, but in her 80s,
right.
still
and
doing
still
this
working.
work.
I think you're still working, over what you told me.
She certainly is helping me out.
But do you think looking at ineffective assistance counsels, does that give you any traction, or are those cases too difficult because it's hard to prove that a lawyer should have done differently at the time of trial?
It's really hard. I sometimes think that we use the ineffective assistance of counsel claim as a proxy for new evidence because the hurdles, the procedural hurdles for new evidence are very difficult. If we can shoehorn them into a constitutional claim, so ineffective assistance of counsel is a constitutional claim, then we can bring new evidence to the court by way of this constitutional claim.
But you don't doubt that Kevin had ineffective counsel?
Oh, not at all. There was the evidence available to exonerate him from the beginning was available from the beginning, and he was fortunate that we were able to launch that investigation as soon after his conviction as we did, because years later the memories would have faded. This is evanescent information that simply disappears as time goes by, as witnesses forget things, which is why I actually think that more responsibility should be placed on the police and prosecutors to do a reasonable investigation and pursue reasonable lines of inquiry to begin with. He told them, I was just eating at the restaurant. They drove right past it. 2 days or 2 weeks later would have been too late for his own lawyer to find out whether he had actually been eating at that restaurant. So I think that more responsibility needs to be placed on law enforcement and the prosecutor themselves, because they themselves monopolize the opportunities to investigate and to get the information that is generated very early on in the process to begin with.
Jim, I know the people who are working on Innocence talk to each other. You 3 talk to each other. Did Lesley tell you that she was going to do this last resort effort dealing with non-DNA cases? And did you say, hey, maybe you shouldn't quite do that because it's a little bit like tilting at windmills?
No, not at all. Yeah, we had Lesley and her husband Michael down to Centurion last December for our family get-together at Christmas time. And we certainly encouraged her to do what she's doing. The important thing is that those who embark on this enterprise of reinvestigating and trying to free people wrongly convicted without DNA, that they be passionate, dedicated, and have a long-term view. There's the race between the hare and the turtle. And those of us who do this work, we're the turtle. We just kind of move along at a slow, methodical, but thorough pace. And I have no doubt. And we welcome Lesley into this work in the state of New Jersey. And I'm sure she's going to do excellent work in freeing innocent New Jerseyans.
I know you've been very supportive of Lesley, but having done this for 20 years institutionally, what's your most important piece of advice to her?
Well, I think she's got it. We should note, by the way, that you were asking how many innocent people are there. Lesley's husband, Michael, I think, wrote the single best article on trying to figure out how many innocent people there are.
What's his number?
I think 3.5%, as I recall.
3.5 to 5 as a ceiling in certain.
And these are absolute innocent, not just a lower level of involvement.
He's trying to predict the number of innocent
people. So let's
people
extrapolate, Barry, with 2.2 million people in prisons?
It's a ridiculous number.
What kind of number are we talking about?
Oh, tens of thousands is a conservative. And I should note that our colleague Sam Gross at the University of Michigan Law School is coming out with an expanded list of the number of people who have been exonerated with DNA and non-DNA evidence since 1989, which is really when we begin the post-conviction DNA era. And you'll find that there's over 1,000 cases altogether. We don't count them. We don't systematically count them in the criminal justice system, and that's one problem. We're really not focused on the right issues all the time, and we don't collect the right data.
Well, also there are implications of DNA that go beyond DNA, because once you've established that somebody is innocent by virtue of DNA, then all the other things we thought were reliable suddenly are called into question. Lesley, as you talk to people about what you're doing, are you finding that people in the general population are aware of this sea change among those who've focused on the justice system in how we are a little less trustful of verdicts?
With 15 seconds remaining.
Yes, that's very
I think
unfair.
that's what the DNA exonerations have done, is brought more to the public mind how unreliable this type of information can be.
Lesley, we're going to have to leave it there for this first program in our three-part series on exoneration, with our thanks to Lesley Reisinger, to Jim McCloskey, and to Barry Scheck, who will be back with us for next week's look at clearing the innocent and how the news of DNA reversals has affected public confidence in the justice system, the certainty of guilt and innocence.
But before we close, we'd like to share some news of our own. At the recent Mid-Atlantic Emmys, Due Process was again awarded the Emmy for Outstanding Discussion Series. Still another reason to watch us next week and every other week for cutting-edge issues of legal and social justice. Till then, we hope you'll look for us on our new website, dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu, or on Facebook at facebook.com/dueprocesstv. And you can write us at info@dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu. For Sandy and all of us at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for staying with us.
Knowing that you were innocent, did you feel like you were the only one? Or did you think, hey, there are probably a lot of other guys like me in here?
That's exactly what I thought, because I figured I cannot be the only one. You know, there's many people claim to be innocent when they're in prison. I can't say that they're not, because I know I was. So I can't say, no, you're not. I have no proof of that. So yeah, I don't believe everybody, but I know that there are people out there still that are in prison innocently.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.